The woman history would remember as Luji was born around 241 BCE in Shanfu County, a region that, at the time, held no special claim to power or prophecy. Her father, Lu Wen, served as a minor official in the Qin administration, placing the family in the lower rungs of the bureaucratic elite. There was no imperial blood in her veins, no military tradition, no vast wealth. She grew up in a world shaped by hierarchy and caution, where survival meant understanding one's place. And yet, in this quiet environment, the foundation of her political instincts began to form, not in grand gestures, but in the subtleties of watching, listening, and waiting. Her marriage to Liu Bang, then a local low-level official, coarse and unruly, offered no indication of the future she would eventually seize. At the time of their union, he was known more for drinking and disregard for regulations than for any vision of leadership. But Luji, whether by arrangement or instinct, stayed by his side as his fortunes began to shift, first slowly, then violently, with the collapse of the Qin dynasty. As the Qin Empire fell into chaos and rebellion erupted across the land, Liu Bang emerged as one of many contenders vying for control. Unlike aristocrats or seasoned generals, he carried the aura of the common man, leading soldiers and peasants alike under banners of reform and promise. Luji remained behind during many of these early campaigns, managing household affairs and navigating the growing web of alliances, betrayals, and shifting loyalties that followed her husband's rise. Her presence was not ornamental. Though she did not command armies or draft edicts, she was trusted with sensitive political responsibilities when Liu Bang was away. She secured family alliances, managed resources, and learned the rhythms of political manipulation long before she ever stepped into court robes. When Liu Bang clashed with Xiang Yu, the powerful general who briefly split the empire, Luji was captured and held hostage for a time. Her survival and her eventual release showed not only her resilience, but also her political value. She was not discarded or sidelined in the chaos. Even then, her role was one of strategic consequence. After Liu Bang's eventual victory and founding of the Han Dynasty in 212 BCE, Luji was named Empress. It was a ceremonial elevation, official, public, but tightly contained within the boundaries of ritual. In the newly unified empire, power remained firmly in the hands of the emperor and his military advisors. Luji, now living inside the imperial court, was surrounded by officials who did not see her as a participant in governance, but she paid close attention. The early Han court was fragile, held together by newly submitted warlords, insecure alliances, and a bureaucracy still riddled with Qin-era thinking. Liu Bang's reign was turbulent, marked by conflict with former allies and constant threats from regional nobles. As he governed through force and charisma, Luji studied the relationships that sustained the empire, who controlled appointments, who gained favor, who disappeared from court without explanation. She understood that the real seat of power was not the throne itself, but the network of influence that surrounded it. Within the palace, her influence grew more quietly. She built relationships not only with ministers, but also with eunuchs, palace staff, and family members who could be elevated or removed as needed. Her son, Liu Ying, was named crown prince early in the dynasty, giving her a direct stake in the future of imperial succession. But even this did not guarantee safety. Other women entered the emperor's life, especially consort Qi. who bore him another son, a potential rival to her own. Luji's political instincts sharpened in these years, not in open conflict, but in the pressure to secure her lineage without drawing the kind of attention that might provoke backlash. Her position was never guaranteed. Liu Bang's attitude toward her shifted over time, and as he indulged new favorites and distanced himself from old allies, Luji's future depended entirely on how she navigated the court's volatile loyalties. By the time the emperor's health began to fail, Luji had already cultivated a quiet authority within the palace. Though she had never led troops or issued imperial decrees, she had mastered the language of court influence. She knew who would be loyal once Liu Bang was gone. She knew which ministers feared her and which ones underestimated her. She understood that survival required not only power, but timing. When the moment came, she would not demand control. She would absorb it, piece by piece, until no one could stop her. When Liu Bang was declared Emperor Gaozu of Han in 282 BC, Luji was formally installed as Empress, an honorific that placed her at the top of the inner court, but not at the center of power. The early Han court remained dominated by military men and advisors who had risen alongside Liu Bang during the collapse of the Qin. Among them were seasoned generals, local kings, and opportunists, rewarded with land and privilege. Many of them viewed Luji as a vestige of Liu Bang's early life, respectable but irrelevant. The emperor himself, pragmatic and coarse, spent less time reinforcing her authority than indulging in new favorites. He surrounded himself with consorts, courtiers, and flatterers. Among them, one woman rose higher and faster than any other, Consort Qi. Young, educated, and favored by Liu Bang, she became not just a companion, but a political threat. Consort Qi bore Liu Bang a son, Liu Rui, and for a time, it seemed the emperor was considering altering the line of succession. Though Luji's son Liu Ying had long been designated as crown prince, court rumors swirled with growing confidence that the emperor was dissatisfied with the boy's reserved nature. Ministers who once pledged loyalty to the empress began hedging their alliances. Some whispered that Consort Qi's son might be a stronger ruler. The emperor, too, made comparisons openly, praising Rui's temperament while complaining about Liu Ying's lack of boldness. In this shifting atmosphere, Luji said little. She appeared at court functions, fulfilled ceremonial obligations, and kept her distance from court disputes that might entangle her too visibly. But her silence was not surrender. It was discipline. She observed carefully, understanding that open opposition would only isolate her further. The court was still fragile, and Liu Bang's unpredictable moods could turn favor into danger overnight. Instead of challenging his consorts or defending her son in public, Luji turned inward, strengthening ties within her household, building trust with key eunuchs and ladies-in-waiting, and quietly gaining the loyalty of ministers who had served her during her years as de facto household administrator. She extended generosity to palace staff, ensured that family members received promotions in minor offices, and used ritual propriety to assert her presence. Her strength came not from contesting her rivals, but from ensuring that the machinery of daily palace life ran through her hands. This restraint was not without cost. Publicly, she endured humiliation. When Consort Qi was granted special privileges, given more lavish quarters, and allowed to flout traditional etiquette, Luji made no protest. Even when Liu Bang reduced her own ceremonial appearances, replacing her with Consort Qi at public events, she maintained composure. The emperor's generals, many of whom were unsympathetic to court traditions, joined in the mockery, seeing her absence as a sign of weakness. But while they celebrated her silence as defeat, Lü Zhi was already reshaping her role. She understood that temporary retreat could secure long-term survival. Her goal was not to be visible. It was to be essential. Privately, she reinforced her son's position. She ensured that Liu Ying's tutors were loyal, that his household was disciplined, and that he grew up insulated from the court's instability. She also took quiet note of which officials aligned themselves with Consort Qi and her son. Every gift, every title, every promotion granted in opposition to her son's future was recorded, not for retaliation, but for preparation. She was building a memory of the court's divisions, waiting for a moment when memory could become power. And as Liu Bang's health began to falter after years of campaigns and overindulgence, Luji understood that this moment was approaching. Her strategy was not built on popularity or affection. She did not need the emperor's love or the court's approval. What she needed was patience. She would wait through every insult, every exclusion, every whispered prophecy of her fall, because she knew that once the emperor was gone, the battle for succession would not be about sentiment. It would be about control, and by then, she intended to already have it. The naming of Liu Ying as crown prince was a formal victory for Luji, but in the Han court, titles did not guarantee permanence. From the moment the designation was made, pressure mounted to undo it. Officials aligned with Consort Qi lobbied for her son, Liu Rui, to be recognized instead. Rui was younger but more assertive, and he carried the full weight of his mother's influence and the emperor's affection. Liu Bang, increasingly swayed by personal favoritism rather than statecraft, began to entertain the possibility. He criticized Liu Ying's cautious temperament, wondered aloud whether a bolder heir might better secure the dynasty, and allowed his court to fracture along lines of maternal ambition. For Luji, this was not merely a personal threat. It was an existential one. If her son were displaced, her position would disintegrate, and with it, every alliance she had carefully cultivated. But Luji did not move in haste. She recognized that overt confrontation would only provoke the emperor's defiance. Instead, she responded with calculated restraint and invisible precision. Where Consort Qi operated through performance and presence, Luji worked through bureaucracy and ritual. She solidified her son's network by arranging strategic marriages between her relatives and influential families, weaving her bloodline into the very fabric of court stability. These alliances ensured that Liu Ying's ascension would benefit more than just his mother. It would preserve the honor and future of multiple households. To oppose him would be to jeopardize the interests of those already bound to his succession. At the same time, Luji took quiet steps to isolate Consort Qi's camp. Some of her rivals were dismissed on pretexts of misconduct. Others were reassigned to distant provinces, far from the palace's influence. Those who continued to advocate too forcefully for Liu Rui found themselves accused of corruption or failure in office, allegations that often ended in exile or execution. Each removal was lawful, documented, and seemingly unconnected. There were no grand purges, no public spectacles. Instead, her methods were procedural, deliberate, and above all, deniable. She wielded the tools of governance like a surgeon, cutting precisely, never more than necessary, but never less than required. Within the inner court, she cultivated an atmosphere of caution. Ministers learned that siding with Consort Xi meant risking their careers, if not their lives. Even those who disliked Luji's methods began to recognize that her discipline preserved order, while the emperor's favoritism encouraged chaos. Her influence grew, not through charisma, but through the vacuum left by unreliable leadership. As Liu Bang withdrew into indulgence and age, Luji stepped into the spaces he abandoned, not publicly, not defiantly, but inevitably. She knew that governance did not depend on applause, it depended on continuity. Liu Ying, though passive by temperament, was not unaware of the tension surrounding his future. Under his mother's guidance, he remained composed, obedient, and loyal to ritual. He never challenged the emperor's authority, never spoke against his half-brother, and never allowed his personal insecurities to interfere with public conduct. Luji had shaped him into a vessel of survival. Through him, her authority could pass unbroken. More importantly, through him, the dynasty could project legitimacy and control. By binding his reign to her alliances, her memory, and her strategies, she ensured that even if she disappeared from court one day, her influence would not. In this way, Luji did not merely preserve her son's claim, she transformed it into the court's safest option. As factions dissolved, marriages held, and enemies disappeared, the question of succession no longer appeared open. It became settled fact, not because the emperor declared it, but because the court adapted to it. Power had shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. And when Liu Bang's health declined for the final time, there was no need for Luji to act. She had already done everything. The dynasty's future was hers. When Liu Bang died in 195 BCE, the imperial court braced for instability. The founder of the Han Dynasty had ruled with charisma and command, holding the new empire together by sheer will and force. His passing threatened to reopen rivalries, invite foreign pressure, and embolden those who had never accepted the legitimacy of his successors. Luji, now Empress Dowager, acted before those fears could materialize. With deliberate speed, she placed her teenage son, Liu Ying, on the throne as Emperor Hui, executing a seamless transition that belied the fragile power structure beneath. To the public, it was a confirmation of order. Behind the court gates, it was the start of her direct rule. Although Emperor Hui held the title, few mistook him for the one making decisions. Luji established herself as regent without opposition, but she did not adopt the posture of a placeholder. She understood that symbolic power would not preserve the empire, only control could. She moved swiftly to secure the court. High officials were confirmed or replaced based on loyalty, not lineage. Legal codes were revised, with punishments standardized and made harsher in areas where dissent or corruption had taken root. She expanded the reach of the central government, drawing authority away from regional nobles who had once been allies of her late husband, but who now harbored ambitions of their own. The generals who had mocked her absence during Liu Bang's reign found themselves sidelined or recalled under close scrutiny. Those who remained in the capital were no longer confident in their standing. Luji ensured that every command issued from the court bore her weight, even if it carried the seal of the young emperor. She reviewed memorials personally, attended sessions of the court council, and responded to military reports with direct orders. Her visibility was not for display. It was enforcement. The widow in crimson robes had become the center of governance, and none who wished to survive could afford to ignore her. Resistance did surface, often cloaked in ritual or language of precedent. Ministers who resented her growing dominance warned of overreach, hinted at the dangers of female interference in state matters, and urged the emperor to mature into his role. Luji responded, not with outrage, but with precision. Some dissenters were demoted under administrative justification. Others were charged with corruption, often under minor infractions amplified by legal technicality. Still others were encouraged into retirement, their departure smoothed by honors that masked their removal. Luji did not need to purge the court with violence. She ruled through procedural dominance, each decision grounded in law and precedent. Emperor Hui, passive and gentle in nature, neither resisted his mother's oversight nor sought to assert independence. He had witnessed the palace intrigues of his youth, understood the stakes of disloyalty, and appeared content to allow her judgment to guide the state. He issued edicts, attended ceremonies, and performed the functions expected of a sovereign. But the structure of rule belonged to Luji. Through careful stewardship, she reinforced the central bureaucracy, stabilized revenue collection, and began a quiet restructuring of how authority was exercised in the early Han period. Her policies favored continuity over reform, control over experimentation. Beyond governance, she began planting the seeds of her family's expansion. Positions within the court and provinces were gradually filled by members of the Lü clan. Their ascent was not sudden, but steady, embedded within a narrative of merit and service. To challenge them would be to challenge the state itself. By anchoring her lineage into the administrative organs of the empire, she ensured her influence would not fade with her son's majority. In the architecture of the Han Dynasty, her name became structural. Luji's widowhood did not soften her rule, it clarified it. No longer the silent consort or the protective mother, she now governed in her own right, with a clarity born of survival and strategy. Where Liu Bang had ruled through force and loyalty, she ruled through structure and fear. And as the empire adjusted to this new balance, it became clear that the Empress Dowager was no longer a figure behind the throne. She was the throne. In the years following Emperor Gaozu's death, the court slowly recalibrated itself around Luji's authority. Most adjusted in silence, recognizing the cost of resistance. But one figure remained both symbol and threat, Consort Qi. Once the favored companion of Liu Bang, Qi had enjoyed an unusual degree of influence in the emperor's final years. Her son, Liu Rui, had nearly supplanted Luji's son as crown prince, and for a time it seemed the empire might have shifted course. That memory still lingered. Her survival after Liu Bang's death was an anomaly, tolerated perhaps out of custom or hesitation. But in Luji's view, it was a loose end. And in the court she now governed, loose ends were not ignored. They were eradicated. Consort Qi was placed under house arrest within the palace walls. No charges were declared, no trial was held. Her crime was not treason nor sedition, it was history. She had once threatened the line of succession. That was enough. Luji did not seek to eliminate her swiftly. Instead, she drew out her punishment with a cold and deliberate pace. Qi's staff was removed, Her quarters were stripped of comfort. Her daily life became one of isolation, silence, and growing fear. When word of her son's movements reached her, especially when Liu Ruyi was summoned to the capital, those around her noted her anxiety. She feared for him, and rightly so. But Luji had already decided what role they would both play in the theater of her vengeance. Liu Ruyi, still a child, was made Prince of Zhao, a title that granted him nominal authority in a distant province. Luji, under the guise of maternal concern, invited him to the capital. Emperor Hui, sensing the danger, tried to delay the meeting, but his objections were subtle, and his mother's will was final. The boy arrived in Chang'an and was quietly executed, most likely poisoned. There was no public mourning, no funeral rites befitting a prince. His death was efficient and unremarked, the record of it barely noted in official annals. It was not a political message. It was a personal erasure. Consort Chi's fate was far less quiet. Luji ordered her mutilation, first her limbs, then her facial features. According to historical accounts, she was blinded, her tongue removed, and her body disfigured beyond recognition. She was left alive, but barely, a figure referred to only as the human pig in palace records. She was kept in isolation, fed and monitored, her existence used as an unspoken lesson to the inner court. Those who visited the palace could not avoid hearing the details. Ministers, servants, and nobles all understood the implication. This was not justice rendered for a crime. It was not revenge for betrayal. It was a warning about proximity to power and what became of those who dared to love too visibly, too successfully. Luji did not conceal this act. She summoned her son, Emperor Hui, to view what had become of Consort Qi. Accounts suggest he was horrified, and for a time he withdrew from state affairs, retreating into drinking and avoidance. But there was no reversal. The execution of love was complete. No official rebuked Luji, no allies of consort. Qi emerged to protest. The court absorbed the cruelty and moved forward. In an empire still forming its identity after years of war and rebellion, this moment reshaped the expectations of rule. Mercy, sentiment, or compassion had no place in the machinery of governance. Luji had turned personal vengeance into political instruction, and from that moment forward, even affection carried risk. With Emperor Hui installed on the throne and opposition silenced, Luji turned her focus to consolidation. Her son ruled in title, but the machinery of governance moved through her hands. Still, she understood the dangers of isolation. No emperor, no matter how compliant, could rule alone. And no regent, no matter how capable, could sustain power without structure. To prevent the court from reverting to the influence of rival factions or returning generals, Luji began placing her own blood at the core of the Han state. Brothers, nephews, and cousins were elevated, not simply as favors, but as instruments of strategic design. Through them, she built a second structure parallel to the imperial one, the Lü clan embedded within the dynasty itself. In the military, her relatives were given commands in key provinces, often near areas vulnerable to rebellion or unrest. In the bureaucracy, they received appointments in finance, justice, and civil administration. Their names appeared in court records with growing regularity, their reach stretching from the palace outward. To the public, it was framed as a matter of trust and continuity. Who better to ensure stability than those bound to the Empress Dowager by blood. But beneath the rhetoric, the intention was clear: to create a power network that would remain loyal beyond her son's life and even beyond her own. This network would not depend on the emperor's favor or the court's mood. It would depend solely on her design. Inside the palace, even the most intimate milestones became political decisions. When Emperor Hui fathered children, Luji intervened in their upbringing. Concubines who bore sons were scrutinized, their access limited, their movements controlled. The birth of a grandson, Liu Gong, offered the appearance of dynastic continuity. But Luji treated the event not with celebration, but with calculation. The child's life, like his father's reign, would be managed. His mother, Consort Zhang, was pushed to the margins of court life. Her role was ceremonial, her influence negligible. The infant was raised under the supervision of Luji's allies, surrounded by handlers loyal not to the emperor, but to the Empress Dowager. This pattern repeated itself. Every marriage was orchestrated to bind her clan further into the state. Imperial daughters were married to Lu men. Regional appointments went to those who would elevate her family's status and suppress dissent. Even funerary rites and ancestral honors were used to reinforce her clan's presence, reminding courtiers and nobles alike that the Lu name was no longer secondary. It was foundational. Dissenting voices grew quieter. Some ministers raised concerns about the erosion of dynastic purity, arguing that the Han line was being diluted by factional control. Luji responded with silence. The emperor gave no indication of resistance, and the court, accustomed now to the language of survival, adjusted. But the consequences were not hidden. The longer her relatives held office, the more visible their power became. They issued orders, collected taxes, and commanded armies not as servants of the emperor, but as pillars of the Lu legacy. In many provinces, it was their names, not Liu Bang's or Emperor Hui's, that inspired fear or deference. For critics, this was proof of overreach. For loyalists, it was protection against chaos. But inside the palace, the truth was simpler. Blood had ceased to be a bond of affection. It had become a system of control. Each relation was a guarantee. Each appointment was a ledger entry. Lu Zhi did not merely govern the state, she owned its inheritance. By the final years of her life, Luji's grip on the Han court had become both total and brittle. Her authority reached into every department. Her clan occupied every critical position, and her word moved with the force of imperial decree. But with each passing season, her presence grew more distant and more feared. Age did not soften her, it hardened her. As her health began to wane, her decisions became sharper, less forgiving, and more opaque. Those who had once served her loyally began to look over their shoulders. Former allies hesitated before delivering messages or advising on appointments. Something had shifted. The court still obeyed her, but it no longer trusted that obedience would be enough to guarantee safety. In this atmosphere, silence became its own kind of danger. Advisors who grew quiet, ministers who no longer offered counsel, officials who failed to reaffirm loyalty. They were watched more closely than open dissenters. Some were suddenly reassigned. Others disappeared from records entirely. Their homes were seized, their families scattered. There was rarely an explanation. Lu Zhi no longer needed to justify her actions. The pattern itself was a warning. Power, once built on strategy and bureaucracy, had begun to run on fear. Whispers passed between palace servants and low-ranking officials. Some spoke of poisonings, meals left untouched one day, and death reported the next. Others believed messages were intercepted, that trusted envoys never returned, that documents went missing and were replaced with altered versions. The flow of information narrowed, controlled by those closest to the Empress Dowager, and no one could say with certainty which rumors were real and which were cautionary tales. In the quiet corners of the palace, talk of hauntings emerged. Halls once used by the emperor remained sealed, their lights never lit. Rooms were avoided, not by order, but by habit. There were stories of footsteps in unused wings, of names spoken in dreams, of officials waking in the night with no memory of sleep. None of this disrupted court function. On the surface, edicts continued, rituals were performed, taxes were collected, the machinery of the state remained intact, but its operators moved with increasing hesitation. No one rose too quickly. No one questioned appointments. No one commented on the concentration of titles flowing back into the Lü clan. Each decision taken by Luji was accepted without challenge, even when it contradicted earlier policy or reshuffled key posts overnight. The fear was not just of punishment, it was of being seen. Visibility had become a risk. Within the palace, the emperor remained quiet. Emperor Hui, long removed from meaningful governance, had lost what little will he once held. Whether due to grief, disillusionment, or deliberate marginalization, he allowed the court to function around him. Some believed he feared his mother. Others said he had become numb to the palace's cruelty. Regardless, he did not intervene. In his absence, the court no longer looked to the throne for direction. It looked to the corridors that led to Luji's chambers and measured every decision by whether it might reach her ears. The structure she had built to preserve order now produced only compliance. The ministers remained in place, the records well kept, the military quiet. But the sense of balance was gone. There were no true allies left in the palace, only those who waited and those who vanished. And though the throne itself appeared stable, the empire beneath it had begun to tremble, not from rebellion, but from something harder to detect: exhaustion, silence, and a fear that did not speak its name. In 180 BC, Luji died without ceremony. There was no grand statement, no orchestrated departure, no gesture of farewell to the court she had shaped in her image. Her passing, unadorned and abrupt, left behind an empire in perfect outward form, an emperor seated, edicts issued, ministers installed, but one hollowed by silence and fear. The court had functioned for years around her will. With her voice gone, that will collapsed into vacuum. The transition was immediate and brutal. Those who had spent years under her protection sensed the change before any edict was issued. Within days, palace doors were unsealed, whispered alliances resurfaced, and ministers once cowed by her presence began to speak openly, not in grief, but in calculation. Her death triggered a swift and violent reversal. The Lü clan, once embedded in every corner of the state, became a target. Their positions were revoked, their wealth seized, and their names purged from records. Some fled, others were arrested, a few executed without trial. It was not a quiet correction, it was a political purge, executed with speed and precision by men who had studied her methods and now turned them against her legacy. General Zhou and other court officials led the campaign, acting in the name of restoring the Liu family's rightful dominance. But their urgency betrayed more than loyalty. It revealed fear, fear that the structures Luji had built might endure without her, that her influence could be reborn in her descendants or allies. To prevent that, every trace of her power had to be uprooted. The young Emperor Hu Shao, though a Lu in name, had been carefully installed by Luji in her final years. His mother's identity was never confirmed, and many believed he was not truly the son of Emperor Hui. With Luji gone, his legitimacy evaporated. He was deposed and likely killed. The official records offer few details. What mattered was the restoration of the Liu bloodline under Emperor Wen, another of Liu Bang's sons, brought in to reassert dynastic continuity. But even this restoration unfolded in the shadow of Luji's rule. Every decision made in the weeks after her death was shaped not by vision for the future, but by fear of the past. Officials who had once depended on her, who had gained wealth, land, and status through her favor, now worked to erase all signs of their allegiance. Records were rewritten, histories revised. Her name was omitted where possible, condemned where necessary. But the deeper they tried to bury her legacy, the more it took shape. Luji had governed with such totality that even her absence had consequences. The laws she passed, the procedures she institutionalized, and the logic of control she refined could not be undone overnight. Even as her clan was destroyed, the system she forged remained: centralized authority, surveillance within the palace, and a court that had learned to survive not through service, but through obedience. In this climate, myth began to grow. She was remembered not just as a ruler, but as a force, unrelenting, cold, and omnipresent. The palace remembered her cruelty more vividly than her reforms. The court spoke more of her vengeance than her foresight. And yet, none could deny that she had preserved the Han line through some of its most fragile years. Her power, though dismantled, became a mirror in which future rulers would see both warning and blueprint. The urgency to erase her made her more visible. In trying to destroy her memory, the court carved it deeper into the empire's foundation. After the fall of the Liu clan, the court moved quickly to fill the vacuum left by Luji's death. Emperor Wen, a surviving son of Liu Bang by a different consort, was summoned from his provincial post to take the throne. His ascent marked the end of the Liu family's direct influence over the state and was heralded as a restoration of rightful Liu rule. To the court and the public, his reign symbolized a return to balance after years of tight control, fear, and factional dominance. But the foundation he inherited was still shaped by the woman the court now tried to forget. Her name was excluded from praise, her decisions quietly revised, her memory treated as a blemish. Yet her structures remained. Emperor Wen governed with a markedly different temperament. He reduced punishments, promoted legal reform, and sought to ease the burdens on peasants and local officials. His court emphasized moderation, humility, and restraint. Under his rule, the dynasty entered a period of relative peace and economic recovery. But even as he dismantled aspects of Luji's legacy, removing her relatives from power, ending their titles, and restoring posts to other noble families, he did not abandon the tools she had left behind. The centralized bureaucracy she strengthened remained intact. The surveillance systems within the palace, the reporting hierarchies, the standardized appointment processes, they were too effective to discard. What had once served the purposes of control now served the purpose of order. In practice, Emperor Wen preserved many of the mechanisms that had allowed Luji to rule with such efficiency. Though the fear she instilled began to fade, the institutional culture she had shaped persisted. Officials still operated with caution. Ministers still measured their words. The court had learned to govern through ritual, procedure, and the quiet avoidance of attention. Even the emperor's reforms were carried out through the same channels she had fortified. Her design had outlived her dominance. The dynasty now wore a gentler face, but it walked the same paths she had paved. Historians of the time and those that followed often described Emperor Wen as a model ruler, benevolent, thoughtful, and just. But his success was inseparable from the groundwork laid before him. The state he inherited was functional, stable, and thoroughly organized. It had survived civil unrest, succession crises, and factional violence. Luji had seen to that. Her ruthless protection of imperial continuity had bought the time and structure needed for a ruler like Wen to thrive. Yet this debt went unpaid. Official records offered little acknowledgement of her role in preserving the dynasty. She was remembered not as a founder of the state's architecture, but as a shadow over its early years. Still, within the bureaucracy, there was quiet recognition of what remained unchanged. Policies could be rewritten, alliances reshuffled, and rituals performed in different tones. But the expectations of governance, the need for control, the value of internal loyalty, the fear of unchecked ambition had been set. The dynasty had reclaimed its surface, returned its symbols, and reasserted its bloodline. But the system it operated within, the cautious rhythms of palace life, and the discipline of statecraft all bore the fingerprints of the woman it tried to erase. Luji never wore the title of emperor, never claimed the mandate of heaven for herself, never led armies in public view, or stood before the people as their sovereign. Yet across the early Han Dynasty, no figure ruled with greater precision, permanence, or personal authority. She came to power not by conquest, but by survival, first as a wife, then as a mother, and finally as an Empress Dowager who turned the rituals of imperial life into instruments of domination. Her rule was not inscribed in golden plaques or celebrated through public adoration, but embedded into the very processes of the court. Luji ruled without ceremony, without illusion, and often without mercy. And because of this, she did what few had managed before her. She made the imperial system obey her, even when she was no longer present. She came from a family with no claim to destiny. The Lü name had held modest bureaucratic standing under the chin, enough to ensure a certain education, enough to participate in lower administration, but far from the world of power. Her marriage to Liu Bang, long before he became emperor, offered little more than social parity. Yet from the earliest days, she observed how institutions worked, how alliances shifted, how silence could become leverage. She did not try to assert herself through confrontation or charisma. She waited, and when the moment came, first as mother of the crown prince, then as widow of the emperor, she did not hesitate. Luji stepped forward into power that no woman had claimed so fully before her in Chinese history. She did not merely inherit authority. She reconstructed it around herself. Her rule brought stability to a fragile dynasty. In the years following Liu Bang's death, The Han court could have fractured into regional kingdoms, military factions, or court rivalries. Luji prevented that, not by consensus, but by domination. Her regency over her son, and later her grandson, was not one of guidance, but of control. Her clan was placed in command posts. Her enemies were removed quietly or destroyed completely. She protected the dynasty with the discipline of an administrator and the cruelty of a tactician, and the cost was felt by all who had once stood close to the throne. Her most infamous decision, the mutilation and public degradation of Consort Qi, remains etched into historical memory, not only for its brutality, but for its purpose. It was a message. Affection could be punished, and history could be corrected through pain. And yet, she did not rule in chaos. The state under her control functioned, often efficiently. Taxation stabilized. Legal codes were enforced. Administrative appointments became more structured, less prone to the instability of military favoritism. The machinery of empire began to resemble the statecraft that would carry the Han through its golden age. She empowered bureaucrats over warriors, emphasized continuity over spectacle, and prioritized lineage even as she manipulated it. In this way, Luji preserved what had only just been created, the central imperial order. Her son's weakness, her grandson's obscurity, even the emperor who followed, they all moved within the corridors she had constructed. And while her policies were later softened, many were never undone. They became permanent. The paradox of Luji is not simply that she ruled as a woman in a system built to exclude her. It is that she succeeded where many emperors failed. She secured the succession. She silenced rebellion before it could form. She prevented dynastic collapse during a moment of enormous vulnerability. And she did so not by appearing virtuous or beloved, but by being feared, calculated, and always in motion. In her world, sentiment was dangerous, and weakness was fatal. Her actions, measured in cruelty and control, were also the foundations of continuity. The dynasty outlived her because she did not allow it to fracture under grief or indecision. Still, history has not forgiven her easily. In official accounts, she is framed as a dangerous usurper, a warning against women in politics, a figure defined by personal revenge and ambition. Her name is seldom spoken with admiration, and the crimes associated with her rule, especially against the family of Consort Qi, have become defining marks. But beneath the surface of condemnation lies a more complicated truth. Lü Zhi did not seek power out of vanity. She took it because no one else could hold the court together. And in taking it, she reshaped the model of imperial authority, not just for women, but for all who followed. She proved that command came not from ritual or gender, but from mastery of the court's mechanics. Her legacy is not clean. It cannot be honored without discomfort, nor dismissed without distortion. She left no monuments, no poetic proclamations, no final speech. What she left was a dynasty that endured, a court restructured, and a lineage preserved. And yet, her influence was so total that it had to be buried for the state to breathe again. Her relatives were purged, her name was stripped from favor, but the systems she built remained, copied even by those who tried to erase her. She had governed so thoroughly that her destruction became necessary, not because she failed, but because she succeeded beyond tolerance. Luji was not a symbol. She was a ruler, absolute in her presence, invisible in her departure, permanent in her consequences. Some remember her as a monster, others as a stabilizing force the dynasty could not have survived without. She stands at the line between savior and shadow, between legitimacy and fear, between necessity and excess. Her silence became policy. Her vengeance became law. Her memory became a question that each generation of rulers had to answer again. What do you think? Was she a savior or a shadow ruler?